Paramount was supposed to own Warner Bros. By now. CBS, CNN, HBO folded into $110 billion company. It hasn't happened. Not because the financing fell through, not because a regulator said no. This deal is frozen, and Paramount agreed to freeze it. 12 state attorneys general and the union representing Hollywood's writers are suing to stop it. Every regulator that actually reviews mergers for competition, the Justice Department included, already cleared this deal months ago. The states didn't accept that answer, and Paramount didn't just sit around waiting for a ruling. Paramount just went back to court, not to fight the lawsuit, but to make the states pay for the privilege of filing it. If Paramount gets what it's asking for, the states trying to block a $110 billion merger could end up on the hook for the cost of the delay itself. That's not how these fights usually go. Which raises the real question. When a cleared, funded, board-approved deal this size still can't close, what does that actually say about who controls whether America's biggest media mergers happen at all? Here's the number Paramount is actually asking for: $1,884,726,092.73. Not a round figure pulled out of the air, an exact one, calculated down to the cent and handed to a federal judge with a deadline attached. If the 12 states suing to block this merger don't post that bond by September 30th, Paramount is asking the court to simply lift the freeze and let the deal close anyway. To understand why that number exists at all, you have to understand the clause sitting inside Paramount and Warner Bros.' own merger agreement, one both companies wrote and both companies signed. It's called a ticking fee, and it's exactly what it sounds like. If this deal isn't closed by September 30th, Paramount owes Warner Bros. Shareholders roughly $7 million a day, every day, until it finally closes. By the time this case reaches trial and the lawyers finish their final paperwork next spring, Paramount says that clock will have quietly run up around $1.3 billion, money that doesn't come back, win or lose. Push the timeline out further to next June, and the number climbs past $1.7 billion, plus another $190 million in financing costs on top. Add it up, and you get almost exactly the bond Paramount is asking for. So when California's Attorney General Rob Bonta calls this an attempt to blackmail the states, Paramount's answer is fairly simple. We didn't invent this fee. You're the ones asking us to keep the clock running while you fight in court. So post the security the law already requires when you do that. Bonta's answer back is just as simple. Paramount and Warner Bros. Wrote that penalty clause themselves, fully aware regulators might still object, and never asked for a bond back when they voluntarily agreed to pause the deal in the first place. As he put it, they went into this with eyes wide open, and now they're asking for what he calls a do-over. Both of those arguments can be true at the same time, which is exactly why this is now sitting in front of a judge instead of getting settled by anyone's press release. That judge is Araceli Martinez Holguin, sitting in federal court in Oakland, and this isn't actually her first time being asked this exact question. Back in July, when the states first filed suit and asked her to freeze the deal, Paramount could have demanded a bond right then. She didn't require one. She ruled that the states were suing to defend, in her words, important public interests, which under normal circumstances is exactly the kind of case courts don't want to burden with an expensive bond requirement. Paramount's new motion is essentially asking her to reconsider that same question, now that the price tag of waiting has become concrete instead of hypothetical. Trial is set for March 2nd, 2027, which notably is also around when the Justice Department's own approval of this deal is due to expire, adding yet another deadline into an already complicated calendar. And that overlapping deadlines problem is really the heart of what makes this story bigger than one lawsuit. Because here's the part that should sound strange if you think about it for more than a few seconds. The Justice Department, the single federal agency whose entire job is deciding whether mergers harm competition, already looked at this deal and concluded it probably didn't. So did regulators in dozens of other countries. By Paramount's own count, 68 separate jurisdictions around the world have signed off. On paper, every institution built to answer, "Is this merger legal?" already answered yes. 12 states decided that wasn't the end of the conversation. Led by California, joined by states including New York, Washington, and Massachusetts, they're arguing something narrower and more specific than big company gets bigger. Their claim is that combining Paramount and Warner Bros. Would hand one company outsized control over two particular markets: big-budget theatrical films and basic cable television, enough to let it raise prices or squeeze out competitors in ways that hurt audiences and the people who work in the industry. The Writers Guild of America filed its own separate suit, making a related but distinct point. Fewer competing studios doesn't just mean fewer options for viewers. It means fewer companies bidding for scripts and writers' labor in the first place, which can quietly push wages and leverage in one direction, regardless of what happens to ticket prices. Whether that argument holds up at trial isn't something this story needs to settle. What it does prove, regardless of who eventually wins, is something worth sitting with. Federal antitrust clearance, the kind of approval companies have spent decades treating as the finish line for a mega merger, apparently isn't the finish line anymore. State attorneys general have their own entirely separate legal authority to challenge a deal, one that doesn't evaporate just because Washington already said yes. And they're clearly willing to use it, even against a transaction the federal government itself walked away from. That's the part worth understanding if you work anywhere near an industry that might one day go through something like this. For years, the safe assumption inside a corporate deal team was straightforward: get the federal regulators comfortable, and the path is basically clear. That assumption just got a lot shakier. A determined coalition of states can now freeze a $110 billion transaction on its own for months, regardless of what Washington concluded. And the company on the other side of that freeze can in turn try to make the delay itself expensive enough that fighting the merger comes with a real financial cost attached. Paramount's own response to that pressure has apparently gotten personal too. Reports surfaced of the company floating the idea of pulling operations out of California entirely if Bonta won't come to the table, a threat that was, by most accounts, not received well. Zoom out, and this fight is really a preview of something companies planning the next generation of mega mergers will have to think about differently. It's no longer enough to win one gatekeeper in Washington. Deal lawyers are going to have to model out an entirely separate track of risk. Which state attorneys general might object, what that could cost in ticking fees and financing costs while the case plays out, and whether a penalty clause built to punish slow closings might end up being aimed back at the very regulators trying to stop the deal. The merger review era that companies have operated inside for the last several decades, federal sign-off as the effective last word, increasingly looks like only half the test. So when a deal this large has already been approved by the board, funded and cleared by regulators in 68 countries, and it still can't close, the honest answer isn't that the system is broken. It's that the finish line moved and almost nobody updated their map. So the real question hanging over every company watching this case closely is, if federal approval isn't the last word on America's biggest mergers anymore, whose word actually is?